Hi, my name is Sami Rodriquez, and today I want to talk about the process of making beer. I want my audience to understand the process of how beer is made and all the elements that go into the final creation of the beer being sold. So, we all know that beer is one of the most popular alcoholic beverages in the world today. But did you know that in some countries, beer is actually cheaper than buying water at a restaurant? But beer has become an international symbol for partying, hanging out with the boys, or even sports. So my name is Sami Rodriquez, and I have done some research on the process of how it is all made, and I want to go over that with you. So to best understand the process of how beer is made, I will first tell you the basics. And what are the basics? Well, what the ingredients are. So the first steps of this are the four main ingredients, which are grain, which is mostly barley, hops, water, and lastly yeast. So the most common grain that is used, like I said, is barley. Barley must be malted before it can be used to make beer. Malting is when the grain is germinated. So a germination is when a plant first starts to sprout. So right out of the ground, like right when it comes out, they malt it. In order to germinate, first the grain is soaked in water for a couple of days or just left there. So after it is soaked, then they will drain it. So they drain out all the water and finally left at a temperature of 60 degrees so the grain cracks and then begins growing its roots. So during this fermentation process, the grain creates a lot of enzymes that produce the sugar and that is used to feed the last ingredient, yeast. So the sugars give that the taste that we want. So the second ingredient that I will talk about is hops. So hops is a flower on a vine, and at the end of the vine, that's what they use. And they use this because of the acids that they pertain. The acids in the flower give beer its bitterness and aroma, also prohibiting the growth of certain bacteria. And that bacteria could actually ruin the beer if not done correctly. So, the third ingredient is water, and we all know what water is. There's not really much to it. It's just added in. And then the fourth ingredient that I would talk about is yeast. Yeast is a single-celled organism that is responsible for the certain creation of CO2 and the alcohol in the beverage. So, there are different kinds of yeast that can be used. For example, the yeast is used in order to produce like a dark beer or light beer and everything in between. So all of the different flavored yeasts are used just to create that. So now that I've told you about the ingredients, I want to tell you a little bit more about the brewing process. So the brewing process consists of three main steps, which is mashing it all together, boiling it to get the heat, and then finally fermentation to create the final process of beer. So the first process is mashing it, which is done to convert the sugars used in malted barley. So what I talked about earlier, how we malt the barley, and into the fermentile sugar. So basically to add everything together to get the certain taste. So the first step in mashing process is passing the grain through rollers in order to break the kernel into the grain. When crushing the grain, it allows the sugars to be released from the kernel. So like I said, mashing everything together. So when crushing the grain, it allows these sugars to be released. After the grain has been rolled, it is fed into a machine called a mash slaughter turn, which doesn't really matter, but it's just this big machine to create this the mashing. The process of mashing is to convert the starches into the barley into these sugars. Think of these two enzymes, like the sugars in the mashing, as an assembly line. These two must work together in order to complete the job. Now that I have talked about the process of mashing, I want to explain the type of boiling. So the boiling is the next step, and this creates like a certain heat that we want. So the boiling is pretty self-explanatory. The solution of mashing is transferred into the brew kettle, and it is boiled. So the kettle is heated to a boil there, and it is left in there for 90 minutes. Before it is left to boiling, hops are added. So that ingredient that I talked about. After boiling is completed, the wort is separated from solids that are in it. So they're taking out the solids and creating more of the liquidy now so that we can get the beer. Now that the solids are separated, the ingredients need to be cooled down. So the solids are separated from the liquid, and now we're going to get the liquid by itself. So this is down with the liquid to the heat exchange. So the transfer of the heat exchange is chilled in water. It is important for the last step to be done quickly so the yeast can be added that last ingredient that we talked about, the yeast can be added and fermentation can begin. Also, it will reduce the chance of contamination if it is left out too long. So now that I've talked about the boiling process, I want to talk about the final step, which is fermentation. Fermentation is the process of yeast being added. So all of this has been done, the liquid has been separated from the solid, and now we're finally going to add the yeast into fermentation to create the final product. Depending upon if the beer is larger or not, it will be left in the vessel for at least 2 to 3 weeks. So you have to the beer will be sitting for a long time to get the final product. So the larger the beer will be left, the larger the beer is, or the larger, it'll be left longer for weeks, depending all the way from 2 to 3 weeks. When fermentation is done, the beer is completed to 32 degrees to help the yeast form at the bottom of the vessel, and the pumped out slowly through a filter removal, creating the beer. The beer then ages and goes from a filter to a brighter beer tank, which is the last stop before bottling or kegging it, depending on what the beer is being used for. With the final step of fermentation being completed, the beer is done and ready to be sold at a local store or bar. So in conclusion, I have talked about the ingredients of beer, the process of beer, and how it gets into the stores. Beer has the 4 main ingredients that I talked about, which were grain, hops, water, and lastly, yeast. And these contents go through the brewing process of mashing, boiling, and then the fermentation, which fermentation is when the yeast is added to get the result that we want, resulting in the creation. And now that I have talked about all of this, you now have a topic to talk about when you're sitting at a bar next to a guy or something and you wanted something to talk about. You can wow them with the information that I've told you. So thank you.